Inside the Beatles, creative tension was never far from the surface. While the group produced some of the most beloved music in history, the recording sessions behind the scenes were often filled with disagreements, sarcasm, bruised egos, and subtle jabs between band members. By the late 1960s, the atmosphere inside the studio had become increasingly strained, with each member slowly pulling in different artistic directions. One of the clearest examples of that growing tension came from George Harrison, who once used a Beatles song to openly mock Paul McCartney, and did it directly in front of him. By that point in the band's career, Harrison had grown increasingly frustrated with his role inside the Beatles. For years, he had lived in the enormous shadow of the Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership, watching most of the attention and album space go to John Lennon and McCartney, while his own songs struggled to make the final track lists. Although Harrison had begun developing rapidly as both a songwriter and musician, the hierarchy inside the band rarely seemed to change. No matter how much he improved, he still often found himself treated like the junior partner. That imbalance became even more painful as Harrison's confidence grew. Songs like Taxman, Within You Without You, and While My Guitar Gently Weeps proved he was capable of writing material every bit as compelling and innovative as the work coming from Lennon and McCartney. Yet despite that progress, Harrison continued to receive fewer opportunities on Beatles albums, often limited to only 1 or 2 songs per record, while Lennon and McCartney dominated the running order. The frustration slowly began spilling out in different ways. Sometimes Harrison expressed it openly during tense studio arguments. Other times he masked it through humor, sarcasm, or passive-aggressive remarks. One of the best examples appeared in his 1968 song Savoy Truffle, featured on the band's sprawling self-titled double album, better known as the White Album. At first glance, Savoy Truffle sounded playful, quirky, and almost nonsensical, exactly the kind of surreal songwriting many fans associated with the late-period Beatles. The song was reportedly inspired by Harrison's close friendship with Eric Clapton, who had an infamous addiction to chocolates and sweets. Harrison filled the lyrics with references to candy flavors and desserts, while warning about the consequences of overindulgence, including the memorable line about needing to have them all pulled out after the Savoy Truffle. On the surface, it seemed harmless and humorous, but buried inside the lyrics was a line many Beatles fans instantly recognized as a direct jab at Paul McCartney. The lyric was an unmistakable reference to McCartney's upbeat Beatles track Obla Di Obla Da, another song featured on the White Album that had already become a surprising source of irritation within the band. While McCartney adored the song's cheerful, music hall-inspired sound and infectious sing-along quality, not everyone around him shared the same enthusiasm. The recording sessions for Obla Di Obla Da became notoriously exhausting. McCartney reportedly pushed the group through endless takes as he searched for the perfect arrangement and performance, frustrating the other Beatles in the process. Lennon, already becoming increasingly detached from the band during that period, famously grew tired of the sessions and openly criticized the song. According to several accounts from inside the studio, the atmosphere surrounding the track became tense and argumentative. Harrison appeared unimpressed by the song's lightweight style. At a time when the Beatles were experimenting with increasingly adventurous material, from avant-garde sound collages to emotionally raw songwriting, Obla Di Obla Da may have seemed trivial and old-fashioned to him. To Harrison, who was exploring Indian spirituality, deeper lyrical themes, and more complex musical ideas, McCartney's obsession with polishing a cheerful ska-inspired pop tune likely felt frustratingly out of step with where the band was heading. By slipping the phrase Obla Di Bla Da into Savoy Truffle, Harrison essentially mocked McCartney's songwriting style directly in front of him. The joke was subtle enough to pass as playful humor, but pointed enough for everyone in the studio to understand exactly what he meant. It was classic Harrison, dry, understated, and quietly cutting. The moment reflected a much deeper issue that had begun consuming the Beatles during their final years together. McCartney had increasingly taken control inside the studio, often stepping into a leadership role as Lennon became less engaged with the band's day-to-day work. McCartney's perfectionism and relentless work ethic helped keep the group productive, but it also created growing resentment among the others. Harrison, in particular, struggled with McCartney's dominant personality. He often felt micromanaged during recording sessions, with McCartney frequently instructing him exactly how to play guitar parts or approach arrangements. For a musician who was rapidly blossoming creatively, that dynamic became increasingly difficult to tolerate. Those tensions became impossible to hide during the sessions that later became the documentary and album Let It Be. Cameras captured uncomfortable exchanges between the band members as years of unresolved frustration finally surfaced in public view. At one especially revealing moment, Harrison bluntly told McCartney,
I'll play, whatever you want me to play.
The remark was loaded with sarcasm and resignation. Beneath the calm delivery was years of bottled-up frustration from a songwriter and guitarist who no longer wanted to feel creatively boxed in. The remark perfectly captured the imbalance Harrison believed existed inside the band. Despite becoming one of the strongest musical voices in the Beatles by the end of the decade, he still often felt treated as secondary. Ironically, much of Harrison's frustration would soon fuel the greatest creative period of his career. As tensions inside the Beatles worsened, he continued building a backlog of extraordinary material. Songs like Something and Here Comes the Sun proved he was no longer merely the quiet Beatle, but a world-class songwriter capable of standing beside Lennon and McCartney creatively. By the time the Beatles officially collapsed in 1970, Harrison had accumulated so many unused compositions that he transformed them into the monumental triple album All Things Must Pass, widely considered one of the finest solo records ever released by a former Beatle. In many ways, the album served as proof of how much creative potential had been bottled up during the band's later years. Looking back now, the "oh-blah-dee-blah-da" reference in Savoy Truffle may seem harmless compared to the larger conflicts that eventually tore the Beatles apart. Yet the moment perfectly captured the complicated relationship between Harrison and McCartney during the group's final chapter. Admiration mixed with irritation, friendship tangled together with rivalry, and respect constantly colliding with creative frustration. Even inside the biggest band in the world, passive-aggressive humor sometimes became the easiest way to say what nobody wanted to say out loud.
Okay, well, I don't mind. I'll play, whatever you want me to play. Or I won't play at all if you don't want me to play.